Do you fear the unknown? Or do you run into the dark abyss to greet it? Welcome to a special spooky season edition of True Drew Podcast, where we'll be discussing Nancy Drew books of a ghostly nature. So if you enjoy strolling through graveyards at night, whispers through the fog, the creak of a footstep on the stairs, or the chill that runs down your spine, you've come to the right place. So sit back and relax, if you can. Lock your doors and prepare yourself for some very haunting mysteries. Hey guys, and welcome back to another special spooky season edition of True Drew Podcast. Now, for the last bonus Halloween episode that we did, we talked about Ghost Stories Volume 1, and for today's episode, we're going to be talking about Nancy Drew Ghost Stories Volume 2. So, this book came out in 1985 and has 6 separate stories in it. So, the stories we're going to be talking about today are Vampire Cave, The Dark Crypt, The Geist of Meyer's Mall, Witch's Brew, The Phantom of Room 513, and Forest of Fear. So, of course, I always like to start by talking about the different book covers, and Nancy Drew Ghost Stories number 2 has just one book cover that I was able to find, but you can also check that out on my Instagram, which is True Drew Podcast. So, this cover is really creepy looking. It's really dark. We have Nancy's face kind of to the right here, and then we have what looks like a ghost behind her, which is kind of pinkish red in color. And it is right in front of this window where we can see a full moon and some clouds in the background. And there's a tagline on this cover, and it just says, "Can Nancy survive the unearthly spirits that seem to haunt her every move?" So the funny cover spoof that I came up with for Ghost Stories Volume 2 is just Nancy the Teenage Witch. Because I know this book predates Sabrina the Teenage Witch, but the window in the background reminds me so much of the opening for that show, like, you know, where Sabrina was standing in front of this mirror and she's like trying on different clothes, so it was just giving me kind of those vibes. So if I had to give this cover a magnifying glass rating, I would give it 3 magnifying glasses. It's a solid 3. It's pretty cool to look at, it's kind of spooky, and I like the overall look of it. So now, without further ado, let's jump into our first story, Vampire Cave. So some of the characters that we encounter in this short story are Jenny Shipton, who is an owner of an inn, Ron Parker, who owns this spelunking shop, Jim, Ron's assistant, Ebenezer Evans, who is this millionaire owner of a bunch of paintings, Mr. Knox, who is the bank president, and Henry Smith, who is a bank clerk. So here's a quick synopsis of the Vampire Cave. Nancy, Bess, and George are staying in an inn in the mountains and going on a spelunking adventure, but are warned away from a certain cave by the inn owner, who says a vampire inhabits the cave. Can Nancy prove that the vampire doesn't exist and still have a good vacation? So that's kind of the eternal question for Nancy Drew. Can she ever go on a vacation without having a mystery to solve? The answer is no. No, she can't. So this spooky mystery starts with Nancy, Bess, and George staying at this inn in the Allegheny Mountains near a place called Craggy Cave. And the owner of the inn, who is Jenny Shipton, warns them that a vampire lives in this cave. She also says that whenever the vampire appears, there is a drumming sound. I'm just picturing this vampire with a drum set in this cave somewhere. So Nancy, in true Nancy Drew fashion, is just like, oh, okay, thanks for the advice and the warning, but we're still going to go spelunking in this cave. So there's this guy named Ron Parker who's an owner of this outdoors shop in town, and he actually happens to be Jenny Shipton's neighbor, and he picks the girls up so they can go rent some spelunking equipment from him. And so they kind of are talking to him about the cave, and he's like, oh yeah, I've heard about the vampire legend. But Nancy happens to mention that they're also visiting the Evans mansion in the area to see some paintings, because Carson knows the owner, who is this millionaire who's named Ebenezer Evans. And what's crazy about this is Ron rudely just invites himself along. He's like, well, oh, I've always wanted to see those paintings, so I'll just go with you. It's like, sir, read the room, read the car, as it were, because it's like, I don't know. I don't like when people invite themselves along to things. It's like, how do you tell them no at that point? But Nancy, being Nancy, she's so nice, she just goes along with it, and she says that Mr. Evans is in Europe, but they can pick up the house key from the bank president in town, Mr. Knox. So Nancy, Bess, and George, and Ron go to the mansion, and Henry Smith, who is this bank clerk, he turns off the alarm system for them, and then he just says, oh, I'm gonna walk back to town, just bring the key back whenever you're done. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't really understand the point of having a security system if you're just gonna let everyone and their mother come into your house while you're gone to Europe, but to each their own. So everybody's exploring the mansion and looking at all these paintings that this guy has, and George and Ron end up in a room together, and by this point they have started to notice that there's a few blank spots on the walls, like some of the paintings have been sold or just missing. And so Nancy takes note of that. She's like, that's weird, I'll have to ask him if he sold those paintings when he gets back from wherever he is. And George also finds a note on the floor with a list of all the paintings on it. Kind of strange, but Ron asks George if they would like a ride back into town with him, and she says yeah, because it's a little bit of a walk, and she's like, we'll just get a lift from you. But while she's looking at a painting, she hears Ron's Jeep just drive off, so she's like, okay, I guess he just didn't want to give us a ride after all. First, this guy invites himself along to the mansion, and then second, he just offers to give you a ride, and then he just takes off and forgets you. So yeah, I don't really like Ron Parker. So after George hears Ron's Jeep take off, she sees this door with a key sticking out of it, and so she's curious and she decides she's going to open it. So it turns out to just be a closet, but then someone shoves her in it and locks her in there. So meanwhile, Nancy and Bess are exploring different parts of the mansion, and I guess they haven't even heard that Ron has left, and they haven't even thought about where George and Ron are, but they eventually find George, but the key is gone, so they have to pick the lock to get her out of there. So naturally, they're a little bit weirded out about this, so they're ready to get out of that house. And so as they're leaving the house, a piece of plaster falls from the roof and almost hits George in the head, but luckily she gets out of the way just in time. So spooked by this, they look up and they see a man running across the roof, and he climbs down a tree and gets away before they can identify who he is. So when they eventually get back to town, because they had to walk because Ron was so rude and didn't give them a ride back into town, they go to tell Mr. Knox at the bank what happened, and they see Henry Smith arriving right before them, the bank clerk that helped them get in and turn the house alarm off. And George makes the comment that it's very suspicious and he should have gotten back much sooner because he left them a while ago. So Nancy, Bess, and George are kind of wondering, was he the guy that they saw jumping off of the roof? So Nancy, Bess, and George proceed to go about with their spelunking adventure, because that's kind of why they took this vacation in the first place. So they get their spelunking gear, and Ron gives them a ride to Craggy Cave, and he's agitated that someone tried to hurt them at the mansion, because Nancy tells him, she's like, oh, George got locked in this closet, and then we almost had a piece of the roof fall on us. And so Ron gets all worked up about this, which is kind of weird, because it's like you just met them, and it's like you had no problem leaving them, earlier. You could have given them a ride and you didn't. I'm never gonna let that go. But he starts driving erratically, and the Jeep's door pops open and George almost falls out. And I guess George wasn't wearing her seatbelt, which isn't very good, but Ron thinks that the same person tampered with the door of his Jeep, so he's just really quick to point that out. He's like, oh, well, the person who was sabotaging you guys up at the Evans mansion must have been the same one that messed with the door on my car. And I was just like, I was not buying this guy's fake chivalrous act, and I was like, I don't trust this guy. So finally, Nancy, Bess, and George get to Craggy Cave, and they get to explore the cave, and Ron had told them about another cave exit. He was like, oh yeah, well, instead of going this way, you can actually go this way, and it gets you out of the cave much faster. So he said you can use that exit route if you need to. And so they filed that information away, and Bess ends up getting stuck in one of the narrower parts of the tunnel, but Nancy and George are able to pull her through. All I'm gonna say about this is that if I'm in a cave, which I don't find myself in a cave very often, thankfully. I've been to one cave system in Kentucky, Mammoth Cave. It's pretty cool, but if you get into a part where it's that narrow that you literally can't squeeze through, I don't like that. I would not be up for that. And it's just the fact that there are people that do that underwater. That blows my mind. I could not do that. It's just, ugh. Gives me claustrophobia. So anyways, as if that's not bad enough, Bess can barely get through this part of the cave system. Next, Nancy falls in an underground stream, and she's barely saved by George. So another key takeaway that I had from that one visit to that cave that one time, it's scary, but there are these underground rivers, and I think our tour guide had told us, they were like, oh yeah, we put some dye in the river to see how long it would take to come out into the river outside that you can see when you're above ground. It took 2 or 3 days. So If Nancy had been washed away, we probably never would have seen her again. So Nancy is now cold and wet, and she says, I need to get out of this cave and go change. Like, it's really drafty in here. I could get sick. And so it's about this time that they hear a noise and a bunch of bats fly out. And so they follow them, knowing that they must know where the exit is. You know, this is actually pretty smart. When in doubt, trust the animals, follow what they do, because they know where they're going. They know when there's a threat. Like, I've actually heard people say, like, if it gets really quiet in the forest, you should be afraid, because that means that a bigger predator than you is around. So Nancy, Bess, and George follow the path that the bats took, but before they can get too far, Nancy and Bess spot what looks like a vampire on a ledge in the cave, and it swoops down, grabs George, and pulls her through the tunnel. Well, George, it was nice knowing you. I'm just kidding. They can't leave George behind, so they follow as closely as they can. But this is the part of the story where I really started to suspect Ron Parker, because he not only sells outdoor gear at his store, he also sells Halloween decorations and things to scare people with. Like, I don't know, maybe some plastic fangs and a vampire costume? So Nancy and Bess finally find George, and they save her from this massive hole, and she was thrown into it by the vampire, she says. And it's later, after George has recovered from this incident, that she realizes that part of the list of paintings is missing from her pocket. So the girls go back to the bank to talk to Mr. Knox, but they see Ron Parker go inside, which is kind of strange. And so Nancy tells Bess and George to get Ron to go talk to Mr. Knox with them, and she'll be along shortly. So Bess, George, and Ron are talking to the bank president, and then a vampire appears at the door of the office, but it's Nancy in a mask, and she explains how Ron found a secret passageway from the cave into the Evans mansion, and he was stealing the paintings. And Ron had dropped the list of paintings that he had written down in the house, so he had to get that back from George, which is why she was locked in the closet, had that piece of the roof almost fall on her, she was caught up by the vampire, and then the door to the Jeep just fell open. So he was out to get George, and he was going to get that list back from her, even if he had to seriously injure her. So this short story mystery was pretty predictable, but it was still pretty enjoyable. I like the aspect of a vampire, and it kind of made me get in the mood for Halloween. And there was actually no cooking really in this one, so there's no what's cooking segment. Now on to our next story, The Dark Crypt. So some of the characters that we have in this short story are Miss Campbell, who is the homeowner that Nancy's trying to help, Mr. Becker, who is an heirloom transporting guy, George Hansen, Miss Campbell's neighbor, and that's it. So here's a brief synopsis for The Dark Crypt. Nancy is informed of a 10-year-old case by Carson. Miss Campbell, a woman in the country, is missing some heirlooms and suspects a ghost is in her house. Can Nancy solve the mystery? So Nancy, Bess, and George are on their way to interview this Miss Campbell lady at the beginning of this mystery about her ghost problem when a rock is thrown through the sunroof of Nancy's blue sports sedan. So, of course, the rock-throwing assailant is clever enough to have tied a note to this rock, and the note says, "Go back to River Heights or I'll finish you off." Not exactly subtle. So the girls stop and chase this person, but they get away, of course, but they do find a slingshot that the person dropped as they were running off. I didn't even really think about this while I was reading the book, but this person was pretty determined to stop Nancy. I mean, just imagine somebody sitting on the side of the road in the bushes for like hours on end, waiting for a car that fits her description to go by, and then you have this rock with this note on it and a slingshot. Like, I mean, it makes sense, but it's also like kind of silly when you think about it. It would have been really bad if they'd picked the wrong blue sports sedan. So Nancy and the girls finally get to Miss Campbell's house, and she says that 10 years ago when they moved to the property, they had someone named Mr. Becker drive their heirlooms over, but he got hijacked along the way and their things were stolen. Okay, I have so many questions about this, but this is kind of wild to me because I'm like, did this guy own like a truck, like transporting service, like 2 men in a truck, except it was one guy? Like, and I mean, I don't know, like whenever I've moved or I've, witnessed other people moving, you put like your most important things in your own vehicle, like you don't trust that to just anybody, especially if it's an heirloom. And apparently one of the things that Miss Campbell is missing was a Paul Revere tea service. Something tells me Mr. Revere stopped using that after unfair British taxation. If you know, you know. But I also am wondering, like, why did it take Miss Campbell 10 years to ask somebody for help about this. Like, it apparently wasn't that important to you, these heirlooms, because you waited so long to ask for help? I don't know. But anyways, while Miss Campbell is telling them the story, she also says that Mr. Becker was put in jail on other unrelated robbery charges but never confessed to stealing their things. And she also found a note in the attic that said, "Ghost guards treasure where entrance leads to darkness." And I believe Nancy, Bess, and George are sitting with Miss Campbell on her porch or in a front parlor room when they're talking about this, but she notices that there's an eavesdropper, and so she chases them off but doesn't get a chance to see who they are. It's probably the same rock thrower from earlier, if I had to guess. But not long after this, the girls are introduced to a guy named Mr. Hanson, who is Miss Campbell's neighbor, who also knows about the mystery. He seems nice enough, but you know me, I don't trust him. Now, with Miss Campbell's permission, Nancy, Bess, and George go explore the attic, and they're moving heavy things around, and Bess says she'll lose 5 pounds doing this. And George meanly says she'll gain it all back at dinner time. Even in the short stories, George has to be a jerk. But while they're up there investigating, they find a trap door. And the mean part of me thinks that George should do the honors and explore it first. So they all decide to go through it, but it just leads to an empty room, so kind of anticlimactic. So next, Nancy, Bess, and George go tell Miss Campbell what they've discovered, and Nancy thinks about the riddle again, and she asks the woman if she has a family crypt, and she gets the key for it. I know it has to do with the riddle and the mystery, but I love the fact that Nancy Drew could just ask people for the key to their family's crypt, and they're just like, yeah, okay, here you go. They're totally unbothered by that. But one thing that I thought was really interesting about this is that the crypt is in a graveyard in Bayport, and they're going to it at night, which is super creepy, but I'm pretty sure that the Hardy Boys are from Bayport, so maybe they can call them for backup. Of course, they don't do that in this story, but that would have been really, really cool. Missed opportunity. But while the girls are in the cemetery, they hear a voice say, "Nancy Drew, beware. I am a Campbell who has risen from the grave to warn you. Leave this cemetery at once or you'll be in grave danger." I'm not gonna lie, if this happened in real life to me, I'd be really, really scared, but a part of me would also be tempted to be like, grave danger. Cemetery pun. So Bess, being the only rational one in the group, gets scared and says she's going back to the car, but Nancy and George press on, and they hear the voice again, and then a muffled cry, and get worried about Bess. I mean, rule number 1 of going into a cemetery at night, you probably shouldn't separate because something bad's gonna happen to one of you, but the voice tells Nancy that she won't make it out of the cemetery alive. Super creepy. So next thing they know, a masked man pushes Nancy into a grave, and he tries to push George in next, but she karate chops him and he runs away. I mean, George can never be counted on to be nice or decent to people, but she does have a mean left hook. So while Nancy is down in the hole, she also finds that Bess is down there and she's tied up, and so they were right to worry about her. But instead of giving up and calling it a night, they continue to the crypt and unlock it, and Nancy notices a coffin that's slightly ajar. And Bess is freaked out, which I would be too, but Nancy is going to open it, and Nancy points out that it doesn't have a name on it. So Nancy's basically saying, see Bess, like nobody's been assigned to this coffin, there's no body in here, so it's totally okay that we open it. Okay, but we have to talk about this illustration of this moment in the book, because Bess looks like Davy Crockett or Daniel Boone or something, because her hair is a lot shorter in these book illustrations than I've ever imagined it, and she's wearing this super fringed shirt. Like, it looks like a very Western shirt. Like, all she needs is a rifle and a coonskin cap, and she looks like Davy Crockett. Maybe this was a fashion statement in 1985? I don't know. I wasn't around then. If someone else was, please let me know. So the girls look in the coffin, and they find Miss Campbell's heirlooms are inside. But before they can do anything, the man from earlier, the one that was wearing the mask, locks them in the crypt. Bummer. But he says he also locked someone in the room at Miss Campbell's that they found earlier, that empty room that seemed to have no purpose from the attic, and left them to die years ago. Okay, now that's just creepy on an entirely different level. But Nancy, Bess, and George are smart, and they're able to take apart the coffin's supports. It's on this weird frame thing, and so they use them as a hammer and chisel to get the bolts out of the crypt door, and then they escape that way. And they take Miss Campbell's heirlooms, and they go to the River Heights Police Department and report what happened, but I was kind of thinking to myself, shouldn't they have gone to the Bayport police since that's where the crime technically happened? But anyways, they leave the heirlooms there as evidence with the police, and then they go back to Miss Campbell's house. They tell her about finding the heirlooms and where she can go to claim them, and then they also tell her about getting locked in the crypt, and so she's like, you all can just stay here for the night. And so the next morning, Mr. Hanson, her neighbor, comes over, and he says he's glad they're back and safe. So the alarm bells are instantly going off in Nancy's head. She's like, okay, well, we didn't even tell you we were leaving or going anywhere. And so she whispers to George to call the police while she confronts him. And then Miss Campbell doesn't believe that her neighbor would be capable of this. So Nancy's standing there and telling her, she's like, yes, he was the masked man that was in the cemetery that attacked us last night, and he was trying to get these heirlooms from us. And she just won't believe it. She's like, he's my neighbor. I've known him for like 10 plus years. He's the best. Sometimes these people, I'm like, why did you even hire Nancy then? Okay? Like, if you're not going to believe her when she's giving you actual evidence, then I don't know what to tell you. So Nancy insists that Mr. Hanson and Mr. Becker were working together, and Becker copied the key to the crypt and hid the valuables, but lost the note, the coded note that he was going to give to Hanson, the one that said, you know, darkness is where you will find the treasure, and he got arrested the next day. So Mr. Hanson was basically just cozying up to Miss Campbell this entire time, hoping that he would find the heirlooms before she did. So at the end of the story, Mr. Hanson is arrested by the police, and Miss Campbell gets her heirlooms back. I actually really liked this story. I loved the graveyard setting, the crypt. It was really creepy. Now, for the What's Cooking segment for the Dark Crypt story, we had a mentioning of lemonade and pecan pie. Now on to our third mystery story, the Geist of Meyer's Mall. So some of the characters that we see in the Geist of Meyer's Mall are Mr. Lamel, who is the owner of Chic Boutique, Cassie, his granddaughter, and Gunther Martin, who is a cousin of Cassie's. Here's a brief synopsis for this short story. Nancy is curious about the increased business at a once-dead mall and finds out people are coming to Meyer's Mall to see a ghost. Can Nancy figure out who is pulling the strings to this poltergeist? So Nancy, Bess, and George are going to Meyer's Mall to do some shopping, and traffic is backed up. And they comment on the fact that this is kind of odd because the mall has been suffering ever since a new one was built. But now all of a sudden business is booming again. So Nancy asks an officer who's directing traffic what's going on, and he says that everyone is there to see the ghost. Like, forget the buy one get one half off mom jeans sale. We want to see this ghost. So Nancy parks the car, and when they go in, they see a ghost floating around, and it picks flowers and throws them around and knocks an officer's hat off before pushing him into a pond. So Nancy, Bess, and George just kind of observe this, and of course Nancy doesn't believe in ghosts, so she's kind of like, there's got to be more to this, but the whole crowd in the mall is eating it up. So after watching the quote-unquote ghost, the girls go to this shop that they like to frequent called Chic Boutique, and the owner is named Mr. Lamel, and the book says that he's German, and his granddaughter Cassie works there. So while Nancy, Bess, and George are shopping, Mr. Lamel overhears the girls talking about the ghost, and he explains that it showed up when someone was filming a commercial at the mall and started throwing shoes around at the shoe store. And business has been good ever since for every store in the mall, and he says he's also nicknamed the ghost Hermie. So we learned that Mr. Lamel used to be a vaudeville performer back in the day, and something tells me he has some tricks up his sleeves. So when Nancy starts talking to Cassie, Cassie says that business is so good that they want to open another store, and Bess says, "That's wonderful. I'll be able to tell everyone I knew you when you were poor and struggling." This just kind of made me laugh. Like, I understand the sentiment, but it would be so weird to hear someone say this. So while the girls are shopping, Mr. Lamel gives the girls each a sundress, and he says, "I remember your sizes, unless Bessie's been eating candy bars again." Ay. I should have known better. We were in a clothing store, so there was no chance that Bess would get out of there without having her body analyzed. But they all get free sundresses, so yay. But Nancy notices when they're leaving a strange man following them through the mall, but he leaves when he sees them notice him. So after this fun trip to the mall, which, can I say, I would love to see a mall at its peak in the 1980s. That would have been so fun. But Nancy goes home and she does some research on ghosts. So Nancy comes to the conclusion through her research that ghosts are just people who died in a particular place, and she goes and asks Carson what was on the land that the mall is on now before it was built. And Carson just says it was a sheep pasture. So next, Nancy goes to visit Cassie at her house, and she says thanks to the ghost, she'll get to go to college now because they're making so much more money now that the mall is more frequented by customers. And she also says that the security guard at the mall is a distant cousin of hers whose name is Gunther Martin. So Nancy and Cassie start making conversation and talking about her grandfather's vaudeville past, and she says, oh yeah, there's some trunks up in the attic that have some of his, things that he used to use on stage in them. And so they go up there and they're gone. And Nancy finds an old German theater program though, and so she takes that with her. So we do get a bit of confirmation that Hannah has some German ancestry. I mean, the last name Gruen. But the next day Nancy asks Hannah if she can translate it, and she says she can't translate the German, but her niece Effie can. So the program says Lamel the Great and his dancing ghost on it. So the next thing to happen in this story is Mr. Lamel is confronted by Nancy, and he confesses that he wanted business to be better, so he rigged up this ghost to draw in the crowds. And he also mentions an actual magician in real life, Blackstone. I love when the Nancy Drew books do this, and they'll blend in fictional characters with real people from real life. And I was asking my husband, because he's a magician, I said, isn't Blackstone an actual magician? And he was like, yeah. So the next day, Mr. Lamel calls Nancy, and he's very upset. And the strange man following Nancy in the mall overheard their conversation about him confessing to, rigging this fake ghost. And he and his gang have been pickpocketing the crowds in the mall. So he kidnapped Cassie and won't let her go unless Mr. Lamel agrees to use the ghost as a distraction while he and his gang rob the bank in the mall. So Nancy tells Mr. Lamel, don't worry, we'll figure this out, we have a plan. So the next day when the gang is going to strike and rob the bank in the mall, Nancy, Bess, and George station themselves at different stores with walkie-talkies, and Mr. Lamel unleashes his ghosts, which are just these bags with colorful lights inside of them, and the robbers take the money from the bank. But Bess signals the people at the toy store that she's near, and they throw marbles in front of the thieves as they try to get away. And Nancy also pilots a ghost with a brick in it into the strange man and knocks him out and gets Cassie away from him. So Cassie is saved, and the crowd loves Mr. Lamel because nobody was really fooled by this quote-unquote ghost. Like, they knew that it was fake and they were okay with being entertained. So as far as our What's Cooking segment for this short story, there was only a mentioning of strawberries and whipped cream, which Hannah made for Nancy one night. Now on to our next spooky short story, Witch's Brew. So some of the characters in this short story include Eloise Drew, Dottie Hughes, who is Eloise's neighbor, Madame Arnett, who is a supposed witch, Miss Egmont, who's another neighbor of Eloise's, who's an actress, and Mr. Ponsonby, who is a PI agent. Here's a brief synopsis for The Witch's Brew. Nancy gets a mysterious note from Eloise Drew that says strange things are going on in her New York apartment complex. But what? So Nancy shows up in New York at Aunt Eloise's apartment to talk to her to figure out what she meant by her cryptic note. And as she's coming off the elevator, a middle-aged woman shoves past her and goes down in the elevator. And a woman who was standing in the hallway who has black hair and witnessed this happen asks Nancy if she's okay. And Nancy says, yeah, I guess she was just having a bad day. This woman turns out to be Miss Egmont, who is an actress that lives in Aunt Eloise's building. So when Nancy finally gets up to Aunt Eloise's apartment, she tells her about the woman that shoved past her and onto the elevator, and she says it was probably her neighbor, Dottie Hughes, and they used to be really close friends, but now Dottie won't even talk to her. And Aunt Eloise also mentions that she's heard chanting and screaming in one of the apartments next door, and she thinks that witches are meeting there. And I wrote in parentheses, I guess Chai Che and Grandpa Sung, who were Aunt Eloise's neighbors in The Mystery of the Fire Dragon, have moved. So it's while Nancy and Aunt Eloise are talking that they hear this scream, and they both get a little bit freaked out about it, but it turns out to just be a black cat out on the balcony. balcony. So once they calm down from that little scare, Aunt Eloise says that she thinks another neighbor of hers, whose name is Madame Arnett, is a witch, and she shows Nancy a pendant that has Diana on it, believed to be a huntress or goddess of the moon, and she wants Nancy to infiltrate the witch coven. So it's while they're discussing this that they hear footsteps stop outside Aunt Eloise's front door, and Nancy flings it open, and it turns out to be Dottie Hughes, the woman that pushed past her and got onto the elevator, and she says she's lost a pendant. And so Nancy hands the one that Aunt Eloise was just talking about to her, and she starts talking about Diana and how she was in a coven, and Miss Hughes just opens right up to her. And so Dottie says Madame Arnett has helped her talk to her dead husband and offers to bring Nancy to their next meeting. So Nancy and Dottie go to the occult meeting, and Nancy describes the room as having a white chalk circle with a coffin-like table inside of it. And there's heavy drapes, incense, and a picture of Diana along with goats and devils. Very spooky. So Nancy lies and says she wants to contact her friend Linda Brown, who is somebody she just made up on the spur of the moment, and she says, oh yeah, she's buried in this cemetery on the west side. So Madame Arnett just says, oh, we'll do that in a few days when the moon is more full. So they get in place for the ceremony, and Madame Arnett says, abracadabra, all is well, as long as we know Diana's spell, and the other women start chanting. And then she sets up a cauldron and pours everyone a drink in black goblets, and Nancy pours hers in a plant when she isn't looking, and she says, I'm sure you'll enjoy this more than I would. To your good health, or abracadabra, or whatever witches say. And Nancy notices that Madame Arnett doesn't drink the concoction either, so that was probably a good move on her part, but all the other women are swaying and acting really strangely. And there's also an eerie glowing sphinx on the wall in the room. And then Madame Arnett starts passing on messages from the great beyond. I had to channel, Message in a Haunted Mansion there. But she tells Miss Hughes that she's in danger. She tells someone else that they need to look for another job. And then she tells this other person to beware of Peter, and this other person that a new romance will come to her. So everyone in the group leaves money in a jar as they leave, and Nancy pretends to, but then she palms it, which I thought was kind of funny. But as Nancy is leaving, she notices that Miss Hughes stays back, and so she's very suspicious of this. So she runs back to Aunt Eloise's, climbs over the balcony to Madame Arnett's, and then she listens in. I don't want to know what floor Aunt Eloise is on, but she's definitely not on the first floor. She's up there, and so I'm just picturing Nancy scaling balconies in New York City. Like, that seems terrifying to me. But she overhears Madame Arnett telling Miss Hughes that she needs to give her more money, or give Diana more money, to talk to her husband, which is really, really sad. So the next day, Nancy follows Madame Arnett to this private investigator's office, and it's Ponsonby Investigations, and she pays him. So Nancy's figured out she's getting intel on the people in her group from this guy, and so she follows him into a church and hides, and she puts two and two together. So he's going to this church to investigate her fake friend Linda Brown and see where she's buried. So Nancy's trying to follow this guy and be really discreet about it, but she accidentally knocks over a candle in the church, and so she has to hide from Mr. Ponsonby, and so she runs up into the bell tower. That's the logical place to hide, and she accidentally slips and grabs the bell's rope to steady herself. So of course the church bell is ringing really loud, and then Mr. Ponsonby follows her up the stairs. So thinking fast, Nancy hides behind this door to the bell tower and sneaks out and locks him in. So I did think that it was cool that Nancy got to fit in some fun during this mystery. She got to actually have kind of a vacation, and her and Aunt Eloise go to Bloomingdale's, the Russian Tea Room, and the Museum of Natural History. But get this is hilarious. So Nancy gets a call from Ned, and he says he's in town in New York City for a football conference. I've never heard of a football conference, but I'm sure that it would be hilarious to attend one. So when Nancy finally gets back to Aunt Eloise's, Madame Arnett says she wants to go with Nancy to Linda Brown's grave, and Nancy says she has to get her purse. So she's freaked out. She's like, she's on to me. She knows that I lied. But instead of getting her purse, she calls Ned and tells him what's happening, and he says he'll follow them. But instead of going to the cemetery, Madame Arnett drives Nancy to some abandoned warehouses. Very creepy. And Ponsonby is there. He made his way out of the bell tower eventually, I guess. Maybe a priest let him out or something. And he grabs her, and they tie Nancy up and set the warehouse on fire. Thankfully, Ned shows up and rescues her at the exact right moment, but Nancy and Ned tell the firemen that show up what happened, and they go back to Aunt Eloise's. And I thought this was funny that the firemen were so lenient. They're like, yeah, you teenagers, you can go. This may be an arson investigation, and you could be involved, but yeah, sure, go on. So once they get back to Aunt Eloise's apartment, Nancy tells Ned to call the police, and she sneaks through Madame Arnett's window, and she sees a hole in the wall right where the Sphinx is on the other side, and she figures out that Miss Egmont, the actress, has been providing the voice of Diana to confuse the people in the group. And so she bursts into the seance and she tells the women everything. Nancy explains to them, she's like, these people have been lying to you. There's been a woman talking through the wall to you, claiming to be Diana. And she shows them these files that Madame Arnett has collected on each member of the group and all the information about their dead loved ones. So the police arrest Madame Arnett and Miss Egmont, and Nancy and Ned don't get accused of arson in New York City. So good on them. And I guess they arrest Mr. Ponsonby too because he was in on the scheme also. Now, as far as the What's Cooking segment for this short story, I had to laugh when I saw the mentioning of this item, but devil's food cake. Very appropriate. Now on to our next story, The Phantom of Room 513. So in this short story, some of the characters we see are Dr. Daniels, Dr. Edinburgh, Lilith Edinburgh, Lisa Scotty, who is a friend of Nancy's, and Mabel Greenfield, who is a roommate. So here's a brief synopsis for The Phantom of Room 513. Nancy goes to the hospital for stomach pain and finds more than she bargained for. Could a room at the hospital be haunted? Now, I know what you're thinking. Nancy Drew is at the hospital. She never goes to the hospital for anything. Like, she literally gets hit in the head with rocks. She gets, almost strangled sometimes. Like, so many bad things have happened to her. And she's finally at the hospital for, of all things, a stomach ache. I never thought that I would see the day. But anyways, Nancy overhears a doctor talking about a haunted room in the hospital, but when she asks Dr. Daniels about it, he pretends he doesn't know what she's talking about. And he's like, oh no, there's nothing, there's nothing haunted in this hospital. And so Nancy also overhears these doctors talking about how this other doctor, Dr. Edinburgh, is not doing so well right now. He's apparently a really skilled doctor, a really good surgeon, but lately he's been making a lot of mistakes. So it's kind of interesting because in this book, Nancy has a girl named Lisa Scotty, who's a nurse, check on her, and the book says Nancy met her in the Swami's ring. And I actually just finished reading that book just a few days ago, and yeah, she's in that book, so I thought that was kind of a cool tie-in there. So Nancy is put in a room with an older woman named Mabel Greenfield, that's her roommate, and at first she's scared when she wakes up and she sees Nancy, and they both hear this thumping noise. And so Nancy asks if it's a patient that's upset or something, and Mabel says, no, it's the ghost. Well, that escalated quickly. We were told that this hospital was not haunted, but now we have reason to believe that it is. So the next morning, Nancy talks to Lisa, and Bess and George come by to visit her, and Lisa says that room 513 is haunted by a woman who stayed in there. And this woman was allegedly sick and then just disappeared. And there was a rumor that the woman's husband killed her for the insurance money. And her name was Lilith Edinburgh, and her husband was Dr. Edinburgh's brother. So the brother to the doctor that is making mistakes lately at the hospital. So Lisa also lets Nancy in on the fact that Dr. Edinburgh has become careless, and Mabel blames him for her poor gallbladder surgery. She's like, yeah, I would have been so much better if someone else had worked on me because I am in worse shape now than when I came in here. So when Dr. Edinburgh comes in to check on Mabel, Nancy sketches a picture of him, and there's no reason for her to do this. Like, the reader is not let in on why she's doing this. But after he leaves, Lisa says he didn't even note Miss Greenfield's vitals or anything. So Nancy must be suspicious that maybe Dr. Edinburgh isn't actually Dr. Edinburgh. So Nancy apparently feels well enough, and her stomachache isn't that bad, because she goes to investigate room 513, and she hears moans and yells inside, and then a voice saying, Harold, help! Don't hurt me. And then the light won't turn on in the room and it's cold. So when Nancy steps into room 513, purple lights appear and a ghostly figure of a woman shows up, and then Nancy hears footsteps, so she hides in the closet, and when the door opens, she sees Dr. Edinburgh come in, and he laughs and addresses Lilith, and then the ghost disappears. So that's a pretty creepy thing to witness, and while Nancy's in the closet, she finds a secret door into a small room off of room 513, and she finds a stack of files that look like Dr. Edinburgh has been doctoring to make himself look better. Get it? The doctor is doctoring the files? So anyway, Bess and George follow Dr. Edinburgh because he's super suspicious, and Nancy's like, you need to tail him, and I can't leave the hospital right now. And so he goes in a house, and George gets a wheel of her car stuck in a ditch accidentally, so that's not good. But she and Bess go closer to the house to spy on the doctor, who is talking to a woman, and he calls her Lilith, and it's the missing woman who is supposedly haunting room 513. So unfortunately, Bess and George do get caught by Dr. Edinburgh, but he believes their story about the car. They're just like, oh, our car got stuck outside your house conveniently. Please help us get it out. And so he helps them get unstuck. So the next thing to happen is Nancy and Lisa go investigate room 513, and Nancy figures out there's a hologram projector in the ceiling, and the voice only starts up every fifth flick of the light switch. I can't talk. But so it's programmed to kind of randomly generate, so it doesn't come on every time someone flips the light. So Dr. Edinburgh ends up confronting Nancy and Lisa, but Carson and the police show up. So this is the gist of what's been going on. So Harold Edinburgh had a twin named Jim, and he was pretending to be a doctor and performing surgeries. This is so wrong on so many levels. But Lilith was going to leave Harold, and it was a whole scheme that they cooked up together, and they even had a lawyer, Melvin Smith, convince patients not to sue after malpractice. This is just crazy. But then also, to wrap up this mystery, as far as Nancy's stomach ache, don't worry, it wasn't appendicitis, it was just a spastic colon. I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh because I know there's people that actually deal with this, but I just thought it was hilarious, like Nancy Drew in the case of the spastic colon, something I thought that I would never be saying. But apparently while Nancy also had this stint in the hospital, she also missed a date with Ned, but in this case, I think it's excusable. So there's no what's cooking for this short story, but that's probably okay. It was probably hospital food and it probably wasn't that great. Now on to our final story, Forest of Fear. So there's only a few characters that we encounter in this book. There is Miss Johnson, who is a motel owner, and John Bearcloud, who is a Native American character. Here's a quick synopsis for Forest of Fear. Nancy, Bess, and George go camping at Lake Oolaga and see mysterious lights. Is it a Native American curse or an environmental disaster brought on by a greedy manufacturing company? So this story starts with Nancy, Bess, and George in Nancy's blue sports sedan on the way to Lake Oolaga, and they don't see the sign for the lake, but instead a skull and crossbones. Really creepy. So Nancy, seeing nothing ominous about this at all, continues forward. And so they're driving merrily on their way down this road, and next they see a sign that says, "Danger, go back." And Bess becomes worried because she, again, is the only rational one in this threesome. So the book says that trees and plants that should be alive are dead, and this seems eerie and kind of like Chernobyl to me, but did they do government testing in these woods? Like, I'm kind of getting those vibes. So the girls finally reach the lake, or what's left of it. It's almost completely dried up and there are fish skeletons on the banks. Sounds like a great place to set up your tent. We'll just pitch our tent right here next to what's left of this toxic waste. So George complains it's dark and Bess says that they haven't had dinner yet. And okay, now Nancy's response to this floored me. Nancy says, and I quote, "Just keep thinking how good you'll look at the spring fling if you skip dinner." Wow, so we're encouraging disordered eating. That's just great. Honestly, that is the scariest part of these books sometimes. But I love Bess's response. She just says, "Bite your tongue. Also, swallow your foot while you're at it, Nancy." So the girls take note of this weird looking cabin nearby and they decide to just pitch a tent near it, which that makes sense chance. But as they start getting their stuff out of the car, they see floating orbs. So, freaked out, they decide to leave their camping gear and go find a Motel 6. And it's funny to me because it's like, it wasn't the skull and crossbones sign, it wasn't the dried up lake and the fish skeletons, it wasn't the creepy cabin, it was these floating orbs. That was the last straw for you guys. So they get in their car and they leave their tent and all of their gear, and Nancy passes a huge truck that says Dunbar Enterprises, and soon they come across an industrial complex, and the guard at the gate says that they manufacture toys in the middle of the woods. Something tells me that the Keebler elves, known for their ingenuity of creating things, namely cookies, in the woods, are not going to be too pleased about this. So after getting directions from this guy, out of the forest, the girls make their way to a motel, which is called the Restaspel, cute name, and they talk to the owner, Miss Johnson, and she says that the lake is haunted by ghosts, and she says a Native American man, John Bearcloud, came to town and said that the land they were using was a Native American burial ground, and they had desecrated it, and Miss Johnson believes that he cursed the lake and it dried up. So the girls go back the next day to retrieve their tent and all their gear, and they find that it's outside John Bearcloud's shack. So that weird looking cabin is where he lives. And he tells them that they shouldn't be there and that the land belongs to his people. And Nancy also takes note of a mysterious white cloud overhead, like over the area, and she asks him about it, and he says it's the Great Spirit protecting the land. So Nancy is suspicious of this guy, and so she floods her car engine and she gets Bess and George to ask John Bearcloud for help while she sneaks in his shack and just looks through his stuff. So she sees that he has a bank book that has a notation of $25,000 on it and a drawer full of clear plastic bags that say DE. DE. Dunbar Enterprises, maybe? There's also a bunch of candles in there, but she has to jump out of a window to avoid him seeing her snooping. So the girls go back to the motel, and Nancy gets a call from Carson, who was researching some things for her, and he says the Delaware, the tribe that Bearcloud is a part of, migrated a lot and wouldn't have had a set burial ground. Well, yeah, sure, when you're running from the people who invaded your land, it's a little hard to set up a cemetery, but they still had to bury people somewhere. Anyways, as far as I'm concerned, anywhere a body is placed is sacred ground, but Carson also says that Dunbar Enterprises got in trouble with the EPA for pollution and had to relocate their business. So far from prying eyes, it would seem, in the middle of the woods. Surprise, surprise. So Nancy sets up a sting operation near the lake, and she confronts Bearcloud and a man from the Dunbar plant who is dumping toxic waste into what's left of the lake, and that's why the lake evaporated. So Bearcloud was getting paid to scare people away by Dunbar Enterprises. So the thing about there being a burial ground was false, that was made up, but I think the most comical thing to me is the fact that they paid this man $25,000 and he just went the cheap way. He was like, you know what? I'm going to put these candles in these plastic shopping bags and I'm going to make them float around and it'll scare all the tourists and campers away from the area. So they get arrested in the end, and that's the end of this mystery. So for our What's Cooking segment, what was mentioned in this short story was cheeseburgers, salad, and apple pie. Now we've come to the end of this episode, and I think if I had to pick favorite stories from Ghost Stories Volume 2, it would be The Vampire Cave and The Dark Crypt. The Vampire Cave was a little bit cheesy, but The Dark Crypt was genuinely really creepy. I mean, that guy locked someone in a room and left them to die. Like, that's very terrifying. So yeah, that concludes this second bonus Halloween episode for the podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And the next and final bonus Halloween episode will be on Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys campfire stories. I'll see you all next time, and stay spooky.